Brett is going to talk about the federal programs which have become available. You've heard something about it from several of the speakers, but specifically the funding side, which is very important. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the specifics of CRISI and RIF applications for smaller entities, economic development groups, and so on. So, Brett, it's up to you.
Appreciate it, Karl. Is this working? There it is. Appreciate it, Karl. Good morning by 20 minutes. Almost at good afternoon at this point. For those who do not know me, my name is Brett Sebastian. I am the Texas State Director for GoRail. Some of y'all have worked with our organization, some may not be familiar with us. We are a national freight rail advocacy organization. We work closely with the Class 1s, AAR, the short line railroads, rail suppliers, kind of the industry as a whole, to advocate at the state and local level for the industry issues we may be seeing on the legislative and regulatory side, both in DC and in state capitals, of which this has been an extremely busy state legislative session across multiple states. But we've also tried to utilize our role as the go-between at the local level for our coalition of mayors, county commissioners, chambers, EDCs, ports, just local rail stakeholders, to make folks aware of the different rail grants that are available and created through the IIJA, of which there are about 14 that we are tracking, and several of which that we are kind of primarily focused on, such as things that would be beneficial towards communities, not just from an economic development and a freight mobility standpoint, but also from a community safety standpoint. So our bread and butter over the last 2 years has really been the grade crossing elimination program, but also RAISE, infra, some of the programs that saw a very robust inclusion of federal dollars to help not just with economic development projects, but with general safety projects as well. So these slides I have to kind of support are kind of a little bit of a general overview of GoRail, some of the work that we do. I just touched on our mission and our goals, as well as the community engagement factor that we try to engage with. We're all pretty familiar with IIJA and the BIL at this point. It's been mentioned, I think, in all but one conversation this morning. So we don't need to go into extreme detail on the ins and outs of that legislation, why it was created, what its goals are, those kinds of things. We mainly know the different types of grants that are available. I have kind of separated them into 3 separate buckets from a large-scale overview standpoint. These being safety and grade crossing programs, then your general purpose economic development programs, and of course passenger rail, which has the lion's share of funding, but also has a very significant amount that is still authorized and needs to be appropriated in a coming Congress. And as you can see, there are different varying levels in terms of that funding of what is going to be available over the next coming years versus what still has work to be done either in this Congress or the next Congress to get that full authorized appropriation put forward. We're starting to work on that with GoRail. Starting is an extremely preliminary term since we're trying to make awareness for the different grants that are currently available and just see the existing funds that are out there, see applications go forth. We want to make sure that they're overprescribed and that at the end of the 5 years there's not monies left over in a pot and people are saying, well, why are the railroads or the industry not taking things like grade crossing elimination seriously? That's the last thing we want. But once we start hitting that point where we're seeing an overprescription to these different grant programs, I think you'll see us move in a direction where we want to see that full authorization appropriated in a coming Congress, depending upon major legislative issues in DC, of which there are many, if you've been paying attention to the news. So the first bucket I want to talk about is the grade crossing elimination program. If you're from Houston, you are familiar with this bridge. This is the old Southern Pacific line that is over, I think, I-10 and I-45 simultaneously. It's kind of hard to miss this if you drive in. But this has kind of been our bread and butter for what we've been doing ever since the establishment of the IIJA. And I think there's kind of a few things that just need to be mentioned at first when it comes to these road rail safety aspects. Because we've talked a lot about grants, we've talked a lot about DC, state legislative aspects, what goes into a grant. Karl is going to do a lot more, speak a lot more on the actual technical aspects of applying to things like CRISI, RFI, and what goes into it. But I also think it's important that when you're putting together a grant application, evaluating a grade crossing, take that step back from the industry and look at the forest through the trees. And it starts kind of impacting things that we see in conjunction with Operation Lifesaver. So I don't know where the slide deck, there it went. Always expect a train. It is the city and the railroad, they have mutual responsibilities towards trying to repair up and identify problematic crossings. Trains are going to have the right of way 100% of the time. Trains are always going to, if there's a semi-truck that's stuck on the tracks, the train's going to win that battle 100% of the time. And it may also cause a derailment because, semi-trucks, they're big apparatuses in their own right. So this becomes a safety aspect, not just for motorists and the surrounding infrastructure, but for rail mobility, the safety of the conductors and the engineers on the train, everyone involved. And today's trains, they're quieter than ever before. There's a lot more that's going on with the industry than maybe had been happening 20, 30 years or so ago. And there's just a lot of rail crossings across the country. I think the last estimate I saw was there's something to the tune of about 200,000 different crossings. About 80,000 of those, I want to say, 60,000 are private, 120, 140 are public crossings. Most of the public crossings do have some kind of signalization. Most are not separated, but they do have some kind of signalization. And there's a lot of work to be done on those private crossings as well, though those are going to generally vary in terms of traffic, location, surrounding infrastructure. Each one of these grade crossing elimination projects has very significant challenges to overcome in terms of either the surrounding infrastructure, in terms of roadways, nearby buildings. Sometimes you cannot do an elimination like a flyover and underpass because the buildings nearby, you would have to demolish them and people have property rights, or it's not in the interest of the city to do that. There's a lot of different types of aspects that go into it. Luckily, the program has been constructed in a broad version, allowing a wide variety of different applications to be made, either in terms of underpasses, flyovers, putting in signals, repairing dilapidated crossings. We've even had some discussions with some smaller cities that were looking to put in some kind of pedestrian overpasses utilizing the grade crossing fund so that there are pedestrian mobility is taken into account as well. And it should also just be noted that here in Texas, we have the largest freight system in terms of mileage, 10,500 give or take miles. We also have the largest number of crossings. And as a result, we typically lead OLI statistics in terms of collisions and in terms of motorist, pedestrian, railroad deaths. So there's a lot of work to be done in our state as well. And that's increasingly apparent when you take a look at the amount of rail traffic as well as the increasing motorist statistics in some very heavily trafficked locations. Houston, Easton comes to mind, the Dallas area. There's a lot of very heavily trafficked rail and road routes where we've seen a lot of growth around cities as well, where these crossings are becoming, there's a lot of opportunity for work in trying to separate out the system. We're familiar with this map. This is the U.S. Freight Rail Network. You can see the convergence of lines in the Texas area, Houston, DFW, growth along the I-35 corridor, especially with places like El Paso, the Valley, international connections. We have a ton of railroad lines that run through the area, and these rail lines tend to also overlap with a lot of the growth that we've seen in Texas. That's also true for a lot of Southwest states, a lot of growth states, so there's a lot of opportunity here. So what are the responsibilities for an at-grade crossing and actually putting together some kind of application, evaluating a project? Separating that out, per a lot of federal and state laws, the freight railroad itself is responsible for maintaining the crossing in a good condition for motorists to be able to safely utilize. States are then also responsible for selecting the appropriate highway traffic control devices, including the warning systems, roadway signage and pavement markings, and as well as investigating accidents. And motorists themselves also have a responsibility. This tends to get lost in translation. Motorists have a responsibility to practice safe driving and respect a train whenever they're approaching a grade crossing. So we have all three of those different types of buckets in terms of what the responsibilities are between either the state, the railroad, and the passenger motorists. We should also talk about what those responsibilities are, what responsibilities are not incumbent upon those different types of folks. Railroads are not responsible for traffic flow, congestion, and the design of the infrastructure around a crossing. That is either the purview of the state, the city, or the county. Railroads also do not have an obligation to separate out their crossings. The railroad, on almost every single circumstance, is usually going to be there before the growth of the city. That's why we have rail lines that run through the middle of, small towns in East Texas or what have you. So those rights of way have been in existence for a long, long time. It is incumbent upon all the different parties to create a good dialogue to identify a project and then try to pursue it from point A to point B. That's where GoRail is trying to come in and doing a lot of work over the last 2 years. We have had, I can't even count how many times I've had conversations with cities, county commissioners, economic developers about what grants are available, and then trying to send them in the direction of the grade crossing grant. We also have developed a dedicated grant hub on our GoRail website, which has all of the fine print in terms of what an eligible award would look like, what an eligible applicant would look like. It's almost always going to be a public entity, a city, a county, TxDOT, someone along those lines. Obviously, CRISI has Class 2 and Class 3 railroads can also apply. It's one of the different grants in terms of eligible awardees, as well as what types of projects, monetary thresholds, state and local matches, all those different types of aspects. We also have this grant survey where you can basically take a project you have in your mind's eye and start following it from point A to point B, and we'll try to match you up with the correct grant so that okay, Main Street and the railroad line, is that going to be a grade crossing elimination grant? Is that going to be RAISE? Is that going to be infra? I have an economic development project. We want to install a new rail spur. If it's not a grade crossing issue, I'm always hearing folks that want to do some kind of new rail spur project. Does it make sense in terms of a grant application? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I guess we're learning about this. I guess we can go to the next slide, please. That's not my slide. Well, there we go. GoRail is also trying to be very active in conjunction with the Texas Railroad Association to help communities secure the necessary funding for the state and local match. So for the grade crossing elimination program, I think it's an 80-20 split with some set-asides for things like planning monies, rural locations, but 80-20 is usually what you're looking at. So we've made a significant effort in conjunction with the Texas legislature, stakeholders across the state, to make the legislature aware that there is a appetite for grade crossing elimination and separation projects, not just in the major cities, but across the state as a whole. So we currently are circulating a sign-on letter. I believe the budget's being discussed on Thursday. It's kind of been a bit of a fluid situation. I've heard that things are going well in terms of trying to secure some kind of state-level support. I'm not sure what the details of that look like, but we've seen a very robust number of signers from economic developers to trade associations, cities, counties, elected officials, all kinds of different folks, trying to let Austin know that there is a significant appetite across the state for support for these types of projects. This is going to be a very long-term situation. 200,000 crossings across the United States, many thousands across the state of Texas, some of which are going to be very little trafficked, maybe a handful of cars a day out in a very rural location, and some of which have very significant congestion issues. You're not going to solve this over the next 5 years with just the $3 billion that's been set aside for this one program, or with whatever the state decides makes sense in terms of a budget allocation this 1 year. This is something that we're going to need to start identifying crossings, start working on partnerships, bringing it to the attention of the host railroads, working with stakeholders and communities, and start working on these types of things now. And by the way, that's not just something that should go into identifying a problematic crossing. That's probably any type of rail-related grant as well. I think the speaker prior to me had said, you don't want to wait until the application, the notice is released and say, hey, this looks like an interesting idea, let's pursue it. You want to start doing that legwork before that application is even open. And actually, before I get to general purpose rail grants, I did get an email maybe 2 hours ago with what the calendar is looking like for some of the grant availabilities in terms of their awardees and what the notices are going to look like over the next 2 years. So if anyone is interested in the rail crossing elimination program or has an existing grant that is out there that they're interested in, You can expect the awardees in May or June of this year, and the round 2 notice to come out in September or October of this year. For CRISI, you can expect the awardees in August and September of this year, with the notice being available in December and January of this year next year, so at the end of this year. For passenger rail, the federal state partnership awardees are going to be available for NEC in September and October, and for national in November and December. With the corridor ID program, they're going to select the corridors in September and October of this year. So we've done our first cycle all throughout last year, getting the applications in, folks getting their paperwork from point A to point B, and we're about to start seeing those awards come out. And then the great thing with the IIJA funding is you're going to have at least, I think, about 3 or 4 more cycles for all these different types of grants that may get extended in some cases, especially if the appropriations are the fully authorized grants are fully appropriated. So there's a lot of excitement and opportunity before the rail industry on a wide variety of different fronts. That second bucket that I mentioned is kind of these general purpose rail grants, and these are grants that have been around for a long time. RAISE, Infra, I think Infra has been Tiger and like 5 different other versions over the years. That thing's changed name a ton. But these are the grants that fall into these broad scale statistics that a lot of the folks in this room are going to be aware of. That freight demand is growing. There's a lot of opportunity to try and move freight volume efficiently in tune with some of the green and net zero goals that a lot of stakeholders have. Here in Texas, I think we're expected to have volume nearly double in sometime since by 2050. And we're at a point, especially in DFW, Houston, San Antonio, Austin, where we're not going to be able to pave our way into more growth. So we have to start taking a look at different types of modes of transportation, primarily rail, as a way to facilitate Texas's continued growth so that we're not just all stuck in traffic for hours on end year after year, because that will divert major manufacturing projects to other states that do not have that problem. So just to kind of give an overview of what some of the projects that we have seen, what they look like, so you can get an idea of how best to utilize Infra, RAISE, some of these other types of programs. We've had a few awardees already announced over the course of last year, and these are just some of the projects that we've seen. So like in 2022, Infra gave $17 million to a River Area Development Authority in Kentucky to rehabilitate an old bridge, $33 million to the city of Flagstaff for passenger rail and freight rail enhancements along their downtown line. I think there was also some pedestrian bridge improvements there. A RAISE award of $1.4 million in planning monies. So not necessarily for a project, but just to help the city of Tupelo plan out how they're going to separate a crossing at a KCS line and relocate a BNSF line so they can pursue quiet zones. If it's not a rail spur or a grade crossing issue, the third biggest thing I hear from cities and counties is we want a quiet zone. So all these 3 things just kind of go hand in hand. Luckily, the monies are out there to try and facilitate the needs that go in for these types of issues. And this is just kind of that overview that we saw on that one chart of the different monies that are out there. You know, your general purpose grants are going to be the ones that we've talked about a little bit today, CRISI. I'm not going to go too much into detail on that since, you know, Karl's going to talk about that here in just a few minutes. But things like RAISE, Infra, SMART, rural surface transportation, even port infrastructure development. There's a lot of different opportunities out there for these large-scale economic development grants that could tie into freight mobility, transportation, rail safety. They're pretty broad. It's also important to note that whenever you're putting together a grant application, that you should try to tie as much of that application as possible into the goals that are laid out through the state's rail plan. So you want to try to tie as much of this into what TxDOT has already laid out as priorities for the state. Luckily, a lot of what TxDOT's priorities do align with the goals for the grants and a lot of economic developers and transportation stakeholders. Things like enhancing rail access through the rehabilitation of old lines and bridges, developing new spurs, working on congestion points like rail junctions or international connections, facilitating short line access, increasing weight capacity, those types of aspects. And then the last bucket is passenger rail service. So I run into this all the time too, whenever I'm talking with mayors or commissioners or whomever. What do we need to do to get passenger service to our community? start 30 years ago. I hate to tell you all this, but the corridor identification program is it's very competitive, and I'm familiar with some of the, Heartland Flyers, a great example of this. That railroad expansion to Kansas City has been in discussion for decades at this point. It's got a lot of folks on board with it. Texas, Kansas, and Oklahoma, OKC Chamber, Wichita, they're all about it. There's been a lot of work that's gone into that line right there. And in conjunction with the cities along the way, the rail line access, there's just a lot of work that goes into these types of projects and identifying passenger access. So if there's a community that you're familiar with that desires passenger access, and I think almost every one of them would, but they're not on one of the big lines that we've seen on the map and that come to mind in terms of, you know, why is there no dedicated service between Houston and Dallas, that kind of stuff. It's harsh, but there's almost kind of a get in line mentality with the way that some of these applications and some of the stakeholders are approaching this. Everyone wants passenger rail access. The question becomes, how do you take that desire and marry that into effort and marry that into partnerships and do the work down the line so that you're not going to have an expectation of, okay, yeah, Amtrak's going to extend, you know, from Smithville to Johnville in 5 years. Well done, everybody. That's going to be a 10, 20, 30, 40-year project in some cases. So if Smithville and Johnville want passenger rail access, they need to start talking with TxDOT, TAB, TEDC, Association of Counties, TML, all the statewide, all the local stakeholders, work with congressional delegation. It's going to be a lot of legwork, and there may not be a payoff for a very long time. But that is the best way to try and pursue some kind of Amtrak access, is you got to start doing that work now, knowing full well that the benefits of that work may not pay off for many, many decades. Oh, I jumped too soon. Well, the last thing I was going to say was, in terms of ancillary benefits when it comes to these types of applications, we've seen different categories on the applications for things like ESJ. Why does this work for the community? Why is this good for the state? There are a little bit more broader level questions for why the federal government should fund Project X or Project Y. And I think it's important to kind of also take a step back and look at the forest through the trees on some of these aspects, because you need to start looking at why folks in this room, you know, why is railroading have such a passionate community around it? Not just in terms of advocates, but also in terms of, you know, hobbyists. Why does my dad have about 30 different Class O model scale trains? Stuff like that. Because it's an interesting industry, and it actually provides a ton of history and provides a ton of benefits to the community. Freight rail provides $26 billion in tax revenue nationally. It's one of the few transportation sectors that actually provides tax revenue. It's largely privately supported, so there's no continued investment. You know, I think the passenger rail, we had talked earlier about, Amtrak's not meant to make a profit. But when freight rail does make a profit, that actually it's reinvested back into its lines and facilitates new investments. It facilitates rail jobs, it facilitates rail manufacturing jobs, it facilitates the service industries that are served by the railroads. Moving freight by rail is the safest way to move most of these materials. I know that there's been, you know, hazmat's been in the news for 2 months now. And people kind of forget that moving hazmat by rail, 99.99% of those shipments get from point A to point B without incident. And railroads are also common carriers and have to accept everything that is put onto their lines, or else the economy does not function. They also do this by taking trucks off roads and reducing pollution. So there's lots of different ways that you can use the ancillary benefits of moving freight by rail to strengthen up an application. And the last thing that I will say before I turn it over to Karl on passenger general purpose rail safety applications, the biggest issue that I run into is awareness. Most communities do not know that these applications exist. And we do everything we can to let our coalition know that these are applications that are available, these are what the notices are looking like, here's when the awardees are going to be granted, make ourselves available to try and liaison with the host railroads, everything in between. But there also is kind of a gap between interest and effort. because the idea of pursuing a federal grant is a daunting aspect, especially if you're a smaller community that does not have a dedicated grant writer or even know the name of a consultant to go to. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of letting smaller communities, smaller counties, just a lot of different folks around the state, around the country really, know that these are opportunities that are out there and ways that we can try to structure partnerships so that it's mutually beneficial for the community, for the railroad, for the shipper, everyone in between. And where we can step in with GoRail is we can help liaison between all those different types of stakeholders. We can help tell the story of the ancillary benefits of railroading. We can help strengthen up that application with letters of support from our coalition, because you'd be surprised how many folks I talk to that they do all this work on the application, put it in the outbox, and then walk away. Well, that application's not going to get picked up no matter how great of a project it is, because you didn't call your congressional delegation, you didn't call your senators, you didn't call your mayors, no one made a call. US DOT and a lot of these agencies, it doesn't even matter if it's a transportation application. Any application to the federal government needs to be robust and it needs to be supported and it needs to have a buzz, because once it goes into the outbox, it then becomes a bit of a political game as well. Why should the agency choose this? Who's going to gain by making this a statement? Those types of things do matter. We can help out on that. There's a lot of folks in this room that I think would be willing to help out on that. It's just trying to get an application from point A to point B. That's difficult, but I think over time, with awareness, letting folks know what's out there, how these things work, we can actually help get things from point A to point B. So with that, I will turn it over to Karl.
Thank you. Well done. My presentation is actually going to be very simple, and it's directed to economic development, which, Jonesy, do you have my slides ready to go? There. Financing rail projects. I put this together for the Texas Economic Development Corporation in December, and the thing that people forget is that industrial development, which a lot of people don't like because it's noisy, it's dusty, it has lights, it has traffic, and all those things, provides jobs and it provides tax revenue to local communities. And so all over Texas, there are hundreds of economic development associations. Some are government funded, some are privately funded. And for the freight side, there are basically just two channels, and you've heard from Brett and from others that there are many passenger-oriented developments. And I'm certainly supportive of those, but the freight is where the actual revenue comes from. So I'm just going to run through what a typical economic development group faces and give you a few pointers on the kinds of things that people pay attention to, particularly people who are going to give you grants or loans. Next slide, please. There are basically lots of different federal sources for rail projects. But first of all, you have to read the NOFO when it actually comes out. Yes, you have to prepare for it ahead of time, but for instance, in the case of CRISI grants, the NOFO always comes out about the first week in November for the following year. As Brett was just saying, it looks like the grants will be announced in September or October of this year for last year's application. So if we can go to the next slide, there are huge sums of money, 66 billion, but basically the two that bear on the freight side are the CRISI grants, and they are grants. And this is a very important distinction. The other is a legacy program, which is the Railroad Rehabilitation Infrastructure Program, RRIF for short, which is a loan program on very long-term financing, like you can get up to 30 years. However, there are some hooks and horns. And so if I go to the next slide, I can tell you that they all have, and this has been stressed by many of the speakers, the concept of a local match. That local match can come from a private entity, it can come from a community, or in some cases, it can come from a state entity. As Peter will tell you at lunch, today we have a problem in Texas in that 2006, the voters passed a constitutional amendment which created the Railroad Improvement Fund. However, in the intervening 20 years or 18 years, the Texas legislature has never seen fit to fund this. So Texas Rail Advocates is working very hard to get our elected representatives in this session to consider either a direct appropriation or a reallocation of already appropriated funds that are unspent. And there are a number of different places you can look for that. But that state match would be very, very helpful, and I would urge you to speak to your state representatives and senators about the importance even of a small amount of funding. Yes, we're going to ask for 200 million, but if we got 20 million, it would be a big step forward. The chief counsel of the FRA, oh, thanks, Peter. The chief counsel of the FRA spoke to us last year, gave us a very interesting presentation, but the non-federal match requirements are critical. Most of the programs require a 20% non-federal match. However, if you speak to anybody at the FRA, they will tell you that the higher the non-federal match, the greater your chance of being approved is. And it's that very straightforward. The feds, I think appropriately, want to see that the local community has skin in the game. And you do have to be very specific about identifying the sources of the matching and other funds. Even though they can only be a small part of the financing cost, showing broad community support is really important. There is a complicated CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, 2 CFR 200-306, that governs the donation of services, material, and equipment, which in some cases can count as the match. If I can go to the next slide, the CRISI grant, because it is a grant, is a lot more attractive to most economic development organizations. And naturally, I repeat, mandatory is a 20% grant, but the closer you get to a 50% grant, the better your chance of having the funds flow. There are 5 possible tracks, and one that is often overlooked is track 1, which is planning funds. Preparing the application in conformance with a NOFO is actually fairly complicated, and there are a lot of boxes you have to check, including environmental considerations and similar items. Then track 2 actually deals with project planning, with the specific engineering and costing, and that then leads you to track 3, which is your environmental impact statement, partner consents, and zoning. Zoning can be real important, especially because there is a very strong tendency, unfortunately, for communities to want to bar industrial development. I can tell you from personal experience, it's almost impossible to find industrial property in central Texas that is rail served. I've done a lot of work on that, and believe me, it's really tough. It also is tough to tie down enough acreage. You have to have not just 10 or 20 acres, you really need 100 or 200, 300 acres to make an industrial park work. Then there are tracks 4 and tracks 5 where you have research and safety items, and track 5 is maglev, which frankly is not part of the freight out. So if I can go to the next slide, almost everyone qualifies as an applicant. Of course, it can be a state or a group of states, it can be Amtrak or any intercity passenger carrier. It can be a Class 2 or Class 3 railroad, it can be an association, an Indian tribe, a partnership of any equipment manufacturer with a Class 2 or a Class 2, Class 3 railroad or an association. TRB, a university research center, and also nonprofit labor organizations qualify. So CRISI is a wide open program, and if I can go to the next slide, I'll go into some key points. The application is very complex. Most people just throw up their hands in horror when they read the NOFO and they look at all of the different boxes you have to check. People like me do that for a profession, and we can help you with that. Texas DOT can help you, though their resources are very limited. You also have to identify who the prime applicant will be. The key for the FRA's administration of CRISI grants is the benefit cost analysis. And this has to follow a specific set of rules, and you have to have credible estimates of the benefits. Now, of course, in track 1, planning, that's not so important because there is no direct benefit from planning per se. But you get into track 2 and track 3, the benefit cost analysis becomes critical. I think it goes without saying that only capital expenditures qualify, though of course preparatory and environmental costs can be included. There is also, and this is especially important for some of the smaller communities, a specific rural set-aside. 25% of the annual appropriation is set aside for projects in rural counties. And you have to check the definition, it's published in the Federal Register, of what a rural location is. Specific counties and communities, and the barriers tend to be a county line, control that. Then, of course, the FRA is going to consider community involvement, job creation, the value of the construction project itself, future growth potential, and of course, enhancing various social goals. All of these things have to be weighed and considered, though many of them are not determinative, but they are still factors that you need to think about. Of course, political support is also important. A Chamber of Commerce, a city council, a county commission, all play a role. And as one of the earlier speakers noted, on the Senate side, there is the possibility for some specific earmarks. Now, all of us kind of dislike the label earmark, but this is a way that elected representatives can indicate their areas of specific interest. And an economic development program certainly is one that is important especially to lower level officials and to the federal representatives. And of course, it goes without saying that CRISI does cover rehabilitation of existing track, bridge work, grade crossing upgrades, and you can marry it with Section 130 funding for grade crossing separation, and also for the other program that Brent mentioned, which is the national program to eliminate dangerous crossings. There are, and there are little things like reduction of emissions is an increasingly important thing. Safety enhancements, even the pedestrian interface, are all items that you need to consider. So if I can then go to the next slide, that you have to use the standard federal website to create an application. You can't freehand it. And it's specifically, you have to go to www.grants.gov. And you have to have a system for award management, a unique entry identifier, and a point of contact. Project narrative is critical. Definitions of key terms in the NOFO is something that you have to, and I give you the reference there. It is not necessary for an industrial development program to be included in the Texas State Rail Plan. In some cases, of course, if a existing line is involved, the fact that it's included in the State Rail Plan can be very helpful. Certainly, a starting point is to have an informal discussion with Jeff Davis, who will be here this afternoon, and his staff about what you plan to do, how you plan to do it, and whether they can give you a little help. Going to the next slide, of course, you have to check the boxes. There are, and I have some notes here that are the little items. You do have to comply with the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, ADA, are all items that you have to, those boxes have to be checked. Please consider underserved minority communities. Often they are the point at which the greatest number of jobs will be created, and that's something that you should not lose sight of. And of course, you have to have an EIS in some cases. Many cases you do not, but you have to determine the threshold requirement for whether a full EIS is required. And of course, the applicant has to accept all of the various reporting requirements to the feds. Now, let me step aside for a second. Remember that CRISI is a grant program. Once the funds are committed and are expended, there are no hereafters other than the obligation to maintain service at the location for a period of years that's specified in the contract. On the other hand, a RIF program, RRIF, generally is long-term in nature. It also may involve a lien on the physical property. There is an old federal law, goes back, God knows, probably 100 years, that if the federal government is making a loan, it has to have a first lien on the physical property which is involved. Now, for many of you who are on short lines or industrial switching operations that lease property from a Class 1 railroad will find that that is a real barrier to the RRIF program, because you have to get a specific subordination of lien from the Class 1 railroad. In my experience, since I was a ranking officer of a Class 1 railroad, we're very, very reluctant to give a first lien or a subordination of lien. And frequently, railroads can't even control that because they cannot get their lenders or the trustee for the lenders to agree to a subordination of lien. So you have to be careful in thinking about the choice of a program. The RIF does have continuing reporting requirements, which are, some people may consider more onerous. Now, do I have any more slides, Jonesy, or is that it? And well, this just says what I said, so we can go on to the next one. And this is the detail of the RIF loan program. Generally speaking, it works better for a Class 2 or a Class 1 railroad. Remember, Class 1 railroads cannot apply for CRISI grants, whereas Class 2s, Class 3s, industrial switching operations can. And my direct experience has largely been with the Class 1, and believe me, it is complicated, and it does require a good deal of political involvement, which you may not wish to undertake. But the key thing always comes back to the non-federal match. And in the case of the RIF, it's a 25% match. But same rule applies. The higher the non-federal match, the greater the chance of approval. Next slide, please. And you have 20 years and even longer is possible. And the RIF program is now directly administered by the Secretary's office through the Build America Bureau, not the FRA, whereas CRISI is still an FRA program. And in recent years, the result is that RIF funding has been primarily used for public agencies. I worked on one project where Amtrak used RIF financing to finance a bunch of locomotives. And so really there have been relatively few private sector, and there have been no awards since the Express program was developed. Basically, and also RIF loans do require a credit enhancement premium. While it's very small, it is true that it can be a burden, though the DOT can fund part or all of the credit enhancement at its discretion. Next slide. So you've got to think through how the project you sponsor will affect the community, jobs, and the national rail system. The process may appear daunting, but the NOFO is written to cover all possible contingencies, and in some cases you will find that you can get an exemption from that. It's going to be difficult for an individual small EDA to pull together internally the human resources that are necessary for the preparation of an application. So you probably better consider specialist help from sources familiar with the program, and that includes Texas DOT. But we have an opportunity. $66 billion is a lot of money, and that was in the IIJA, and while CRISI is only a small part of that, $5 billion a year, still, it's a lot of money, and we should do everything we can to capture it. Thank you very much.